Welcome, the Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. Comment below if you like. If you have authors that you'd like to see recognized, list them in the comments or contact our author page. Subscribe for more tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten. We'll have quite a collection climbing out of the tombs. If you like any of our tales, comment, ring the bell, and crush the like button below. Unknown Horror Masters. The Skull and Bones collection has risen from the grave. More beast to be released soon. Find us on Fiverr to raise 7 kinds of hell. Check out our other stories and our websites. YouTube, BitChute, Rumble, Dweller of the Dark. Official website, dwellerofthedark.com. Kindle Vella, new serialized novels and novelette. Weekly new episodes. Check out links below for Where the Wolf Dwells. The Curious Death of Dionysus Shall-Not. Our books and ebooks are on Kindle Amazon. Follow, support us on Twitter, Instagram, Patreon, Bandcamp. Dweller of the Dark. Children of Horror. Legion of Ghouls. Tonight, we continue our celebration of Halloween. Each night, we will be presenting tales of the best Halloween horrors ever conjured to terrify, haunt, and delight. The Outsider by H.P. Lovecraft. That night, the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests, with shade and form of witch and demon and large coffin worm, were long benightmared. Keats. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon odd watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken. And yet, I am strangely content and cling desperately to those sear memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages and having high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used sometimes to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except myself, or anything alive but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying like the castle. To me, there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that strode some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events and thought them more natural than the colored pictures of living beings, which I found in many of the moldy books. From such books, I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all those years, not even my own. For although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak aloud. My aspect was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to the youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat and under the dark, mute trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, and would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forest. Once, I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went farther from the castle, the shade grew denser and the air more filled with brooding fear, so that I ran frantically back lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. So, through endless twilights, I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for. Then, in the shadowy solitude, my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I lifted entreating hands to the single black ruined tower that reached above the forest into the unknown outer sky. And at last I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding day. In the dank twilight, I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung perilously to small footholds leading upward. Ghastly and terrible was that dead, stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined, and deserted, and sinister with startled bats whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly and terrible still was the slowness of my progress. For climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill, as of haunted and venerable mold, assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light, and would have looked down had I dared. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me, and vainly groped with one free hand for a window embrasure that I might peer out and above and try to judge the height I had attained. All at once, after an infinity of awesome, sightless crawling up that concave and desperate precipice, I felt my head touch a solid thing, and I knew I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of floor. In the darkness, I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. Then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall could give, till finally my testing hand found the barrier yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab or door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and as my hands went higher, I knew that my climb was, for the nonce, ended, since the slab was the trap door of an aperture leading to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower. No doubt, the floor of some lofty and capacious observation chamber. I crawled through carefully and tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in the latter attempt. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the eerie echoes of its fall, but hoped, when necessary, to pry it open again. Believing I was now at a prodigious height, far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled about for windows, that I might look for the first time upon the sky and the moon and stars of which I had read. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shelves of marble bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected and wondered what hoary secrets might abide in this high apartment so many eons cut off from the castle below. Then, unexpectedly, my hands came upon a doorway where hung a portal of stone, rough with strange chiseling. Trying it, I found it locked. But with a supreme burst of strength, I overcame all obstacles and dragged it open inward. As I did so, there came to me the purest ecstasy I have ever known, for shining tranquilly through an ornate grating of iron and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from the newly found doorway was the radiant full moon, which I had never before seen save in dreams and in vague visions I dared not call memories. Fancying now that I had attained the very pinnacle of the castle, I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door. But the sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but which I did not open for fear of falling from the amazing height to which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. Most demoniacal of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had before undergone could compare in terror with what I now saw, with the bizarre marvels that sight implied. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops seen from a lofty eminence, there stretched around me, on a level through the grating, nothing less than the solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out upon the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light, and not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was, or what I was, or what my surroundings might be. Though as I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome, latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch, out of that region of slabs and columns, and wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across a swift river where crumbling, mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a venerable ivied castle in a thickly wooded park, maddeningly familiar, yet full of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in, and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings existed to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and sending forth sound of the gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in and saw an oddly dressed company, indeed, making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I had never seemingly heard human speech before, and could guess only vaguely what was said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that brought up incredibly remote recollections. Others were utterly alien. I now stepped through the low window into the brilliantly lighted room, stepping, as I did, so from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered, there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I had ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the sill when there descended upon the whole company a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every face and evoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamor and panic, several fell in a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly in their race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. The cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me unseen. At a casual inspection, the room seemed deserted, but when I moved toward one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there, a hint of motion beyond the golden arched doorway leading to another and somewhat similar room. As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly, and then, with the first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that revolted me almost as poignantly as its noxious cause, I beheld in full, frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable, and unmentionable monstrosity which had by its simple appearance changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and desolation. The putrid, dripping eidolon of unwholesome revelation. The awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world. Yet to my horror, I saw in its eaten away and bone-revealing outlines a leering, abhorrent travesty on the human shape, and in its moldy, disintegrating apparel an unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. I was almost paralyzed, but not too much, so to make a feeble effort toward flight. A backward stumble, which failed to break the spell in which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes, bewitched by the glassy orbs which stared loathsomely into them, refused to close, though they were mercifully blurred and shewed the terrible object but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling. As I did so, I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing, whose hideous hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself yet able to throw out a hand to ward off the fetid apparition which pressed so close, when in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness and hellish accident, my fingers touched the rotting, outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed down upon my mind a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle and the trees, and recognized the altered edifice in which I now stood. I recognized, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos, there is balm as well as bitterness, and that balm is nepenthe. In the supreme horror of that second, I forgot what had horrified me, and the burst of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream, I fled from that haunted and accursed pile and ran swiftly and silently in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble and went down the steps, I found the stone trapdoor immovable, but I was not sorry, for I had hated the antique castle and the trees. Now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of Nethrin Ka, in the sealed and unknown valley of Hadath by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any gaiety save the unnamed feast of Nitocris beneath the Great Pyramid. Yet, In my new wildness and freedom, I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. For although repentance has calmed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century and among those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within that great gilded frame. Stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface, polished glass. The Hound by H.P. Lovecraft. In my tortured ears, there sounds unceasingly a nightmare whirring and flapping, and a faint, distant baying, as if some gigantic hound. It is not dream. It is not, I fear, even madness. For too much has already happened to give me these merciful doubts. St. John is a mangled corpse. I alone know why, and such is my knowledge that I am about to blow out my brains for fear I shall be mangled in the same way. Down, unlit, and illimitable corridors of eldritch fantasy sweeps the blackness, shapeless nemesis that drives me to self-annihilation. May heaven forgive the folly and morbidity which led us both to so monstrous a fate. Wearied with the commonplaces of a prosaic world where even the joys of romance and adventure soon grow stale, St. John and I had followed enthusiastically every aesthetic and intellectual movement which promised respite from our devastating ennui. The enigmas of the symbolists and the ecstasies of the pre-Raphaelites, all were ours in their time. But each new mood was drained too soon of its diverting novelty and appeal. Only the somber philosophy of the decadence could hold us, and this we found potent only by increasing gradually the depth and diabolism of our penetrations. Baudelaire and Huysmans were soon exhausted of thrills, till finally there remained for us only the more direct stimuli of unnatural personal experiences and adventures. It was this frightful emotional need which led us eventually to that detestable course which even in my present fear I mention with shame and timidity, that hideous extremity of human outrage, the abhorred practice of grave robbing. I cannot reveal the details of our shocking expeditions, or catalog even partly the worst of the trophies adorning the nameless museum we prepared in the great stone house where we jointly dwelt, alone and servantless. Our museum was a blasphemous, unthinkable place where, with the satanic taste of neurotic virtuosi, we had assembled a universe of terror and decay to excite our jaded sensibilities. It was a secret room, far, far underground, where huge winged demons carving up basalt and onyx vomited from wide grinning mouths weird green and orange light, and hidden pneumatic pipes ruffled into kaleidoscopic dances of death the lines of red charnel things, hand in hand, woven on voluminous black hangings. Through these pipes came at will the odors our moods most craved. Sometimes the scent of pale funeral lilies. Sometimes the narcotic incense of imagined Eastern shrines of the kingly dead. And sometimes, how I shudder to recall it, the frightful, soul-upheaving stenches of the uncovered grave. Around the walls of this repellent chamber were cases of antique mummies, alternating with comely, lifelike bodies, perfectly stuffed and cured by the taxidermist art, and with headstones snatched from the oldest churchyards of the world. Niches here and there contain skulls of all shapes and heads preserved in various stages of dissolution. There, one might find the rotting bald pates of famous noblemen and the fresh and radiantly golden heads of new-buried children. Statues and paintings there were, all of fiendish subjects and some executed by St. John and myself. A locked portfolio, bound in tanned human skin, held certain unknown and unnameable drawings, which it was rumored Goya had perpetrated but dared not acknowledge. There were nauseous musical instruments, stringed, brass, and woodwind, on which St. John and I sometimes produced dissonances of exquisite morbidity and cacodemoniacal ghastliness, whilst in a multitude of inlaid ebony cabinets reposed the most incredible and unimaginable variety of tomb loot ever assembled by human madness and perversity. It is of this loot in particular that I must not speak. Thank God I had the courage to destroy it long before I thought of destroying myself. The predatory excursions on which we collected our unmentionable treasures were always artistically memorable events. We were no vulgar ghouls, but worked only under certain conditions of mood, landscape, environment, weather, season, and moonlight. These pastimes were to us the most exquisite form of ecstatic expression, and we gave their details a fastidious technical care, an inappropriate hour, a jarring lighting effect, or a clumsy manipulation of the damp sod would almost totally destroy for us that ecstatic titillation which followed the exhumation of some ominous, grinning secret of the earth. Our quest for novel scenes and piquant conditions was feverish and insatiate. St. John was always the leader, and he it was who led the way at last to that mocking, accursed spot which brought us our hideous and inevitable doom. By what malign fatality were we lured to that terrible Holland churchyard? I think it was the dark rumor and legendary, the tales of one buried for 5 centuries, who had himself been a ghoul in his time and had stolen a potent thing from a mighty sepulchre. I can recall the scene in these final moments. The pale autumnal moon over the graves, casting long, horrible shadows. The grotesque trees drooping sullenly to meet the neglected grass and the crumbling slabs. The vast legions of strangely colossal bats that flew against the moon. The antique, ivied church pointing a huge spectral finger at the livid sky. The phosphorescent insects that danced like death fires under the yews in a distant corner. The odors of mold vegetation, and less explicable things that mingled feebly with the night wind from over far swamps and seas. And, worst of all, the faint, deep-toned baying of some gigantic hound, which we could neither see nor definitely place. As we heard this suggestion of baying, we shuddered, remembering the tales of the peasantry, for he whom we sought had centuries before been found in this selfsame spot, torn and mangled by the claws and teeth of some unspeakable beast. I remember how we delved in this ghoul's grave with our spades, and how we thrilled at the picture of ourselves, the grave, the pale watching moon, the horrible shadows, the grotesque trees, the titanic bats, the antique church, the dancing death fires, the sickening odors, the gently moaning night wind, and the strange, half-heard, directionless baying of whose objective existence we could scarcely be sure. Then we struck a substance harder than the damp mold and beheld a rotting, oblong box crusted with mineral deposits from the long, undisturbed ground. It was incredibly tough and thick, but so old that we finally pried it open and feasted our eyes on what it held. Much, amazingly much, was left of the object, despite the lapse of 500 years. The skeleton, though crushed in places by the jaws of the thing that had killed it, held together with surprising firmness, and we gloated over the clean, white skull with its long, firm teeth and its eyeless sockets that once had glowed with a charnel fever like our own. In the coffin lay an amulet of curious and exotic design, which had apparently been worn around the sleeper's neck. It was the oddly conventionalized figure of a crouching winged hound or sphinx with a semi-canine face, and was exquisitely carved in antique oriental fashion from a small piece of green jade. The expression on its features was repellent in the extreme, savoring at once of death, bestiality, and malevolence. Around the base was an inscription in characters which neither St. John nor I could identify. And on the bottom, like a maker's seal, was graven a grotesque and formidable skull. Immediately upon beholding this amulet, we knew that we must possess it, that this treasure alone was our logical pelf from the centuried grave. Even had its outlines been unfamiliar, we would have desired it, but as we looked more closely, we saw that it was not wholly unfamiliar. Alien it indeed was to all art and literature, which sane and balanced readers know, but we recognized it as the thing hinted of in the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, the ghastly sole symbol of the corpse-eating cult of inaccessible Ling in Central Asia. All too well did we trace the sinister lineaments described by the old Arab demonologist. lineaments, he wrote, drawn from some obscure supernatural manifestation of the souls of those who vexed and gnawed at the dead. Seizing the green jade object, we gave a last glance at the bleached and cavern-eyed face of its owner and closed up the grave as we found it. As we hastened from that abhorrent spot, the stolen amulet in St. John's pocket, we thought we saw the bats descend in a body to the earth we had so lately rifled, as if seeking for some cursed and unholy nourishment. But the autumn moon shone weak and pale, and we could not be sure. So, too, as we sailed the next day away from Holland to our home, we thought we heard the faint, distant baying of some gigantic hound in the background. But the autumn wind moaned sad and wan, and we could not be sure. 2. Less than a week after our return to England, strange things began to happen. We lived as recluses, devoid of friends, alone, and without servants, in a few rooms of an ancient manor house on a bleak and unfrequented moor, so that our doors were seldom disturbed by the knock of the visitor. Now, however, we were troubled by what seemed to be frequent fumblings in the night, not only around the doors, but around the windows also, upper as well as lower. Once we fancied that a large, opaque body darkened the library window when the moon was shining against it, and another time we thought we heard a whirring or flapping sound not far off. On each occasion, investigation revealed nothing, and we began to ascribe the occurrences to imagination alone. That same curiously disturbed imagination, which still prolonged in our ears the faint, far baying we thought we had heard in the Holland churchyard. The jade amulet now reposed in a niche in our museum, and sometimes we burned strangely scented candles before it. We read much in Alhazred's Necronomicon about its properties and about the relation of ghosts, souls, to the objects it symbolized, and were disturbed by what we read. Then terror came. On the night of September 24th, 19 I heard a knock at my chamber door. Fancying it was St. John's, I bade the knocker enter, but was answered only by a shrill laugh. There was no one in the corridor. When I aroused St. John from his sleep, he professed entire ignorance of the event and became as worried as I. It was that night that the faint, distant baying over the moor became to us a certain and dreaded reality. 4 days later, whilst we were both in the hidden museum, there came a low, cautious scratching at the single door which led to the secret library staircase. Our alarm was now divided, for besides our fear of the unknown, we had always entertained a dread that our grisly collection might be discovered. Extinguishing all lights, we proceeded to the door and threw it suddenly open, whereupon we felt an unaccountable rush of air and heard, as if receding far away, a queer combination of rustling, tittering, and articulate chatter. Whether we were mad, dreaming, or in our senses, we did not try to determine. We only realized, with the blackest of apprehensions, that the apparently disembodied chatter was beyond a doubt in the Dutch language. After that, we lived in growing horror and fascination. Mostly we held to the theory that we were jointly going mad from our life of unnatural excitements. But sometimes it pleased us more to dramatize ourselves as the victims of some creeping and appalling doom. Bizarre manifestations were now too frequent to count. Our lonely house was seemingly alive with the presence of some malign being whose nature we could not guess. And every night, that demoniac baying rolled over the wind-swept moor, always louder and louder. On October 29, we found in the soft earth, underneath the library window, a series of footprints, utterly impossible to describe. They were as baffling as the hordes of great bats which haunted the old manor house in unprecedented and increasing numbers. The horror reached a culmination on November 18th when St. John, walking home after dark from the dismal railway station, was seized by some frightful carnivorous thing and torn to ribbons. His screams had reached the house, and I had hastened to the terrible scene in time to hear a whir of wings and see a vague black cloudy thing silhouetted against the rising moon. My friend was dying when I spoke to him, and he could not answer coherently. All he could do was to whisper, "The amulet, that damn thing." Then he collapsed, an inert mass of mangled flesh. I buried him the next midnight in one of our neglected gardens and mumbled over his body one of the devilish rituals he had loved in life. And as I pronounced the last demoniac sentence, I heard afar on the moor the faint baying of some gigantic hound. The moon was up, but I dared not look at it. And when I saw on the dim-lighted moor a wide, nebulous shadow sweeping from mound to mound, I shut my eyes and threw myself face down upon the ground. When I arose, trembling, I know not how much later, I staggered into the house and made shocking obeisances before the enshrined amulet of green jade. Being now afraid to live alone in the ancient house on the moor, I departed on the following day for London, taking with me the amulet after destroying by fire and burial the rest of the impious collection in the museum. But after 3 nights, I heard the baying again, and before a week was over, felt strange eyes upon me whenever it was dark. One evening, as I strolled on Victoria Embankment for some needed air, I saw a black shape obscure one of the reflections of the lamps in the water. A wind, stronger than the night wind, rushed by, and I knew that what had befallen St. John must soon befall me. The next day, I carefully wrapped the green jade amulet and sailed for Holland. What mercy I might gain by returning the thing to its silent, sleeping owner, I knew not. But I felt that I must at least try any step conceivably logical. What the hound was and why it had pursued me were questions still vague. But I had first heard the baying in that ancient churchyard, and every subsequent event, including St. John's dying whisper, had served to connect the curse with the stealing of the amulet. Accordingly, I sank into the nethermost abysses of despair when, at an inn in Rotterdam, I discovered that thieves had despoiled me of this sole means of salvation. The baying was loud that evening, and in the morning I read of a nameless deed in the vilest quarter of the city. The rabble were in terror, for upon an evil tenement had fallen a red death beyond the foulest previous crime of the neighborhood. In a squalid thieves' den, an entire family had been torn to shreds by an unknown thing which left no trace, and those around had heard all night above the usual clamor of drunken voices, a faint, deep, insistent note as of a gigantic hound. So, at last I stood again in the unwholesome churchyard where a pale winter moon cast hideous shadows and leafless trees drooped sullenly to meet the withered, frosty grass and cracking slabs, and the ivied church pointed a jeering finger at the unfriendly sky, and the night wind howled maniacally from over frozen swamps and frigid seas. The baying was very faint now, and it ceased altogether as I approached the ancient grave I had once violated and frightened away an abnormally large horde of bats which had been hovering curiously around it. I know not why I went thither unless to pray or gibber out insane pleas and apologies to the calm, white thing that lay within. But whatever my reason, I attacked the half-frozen sod with a desperation partly mine and partly that of a dominating will outside myself. Excavation was much easier than I expected, though at one point I encountered a queer interruption when a lean vulture darted down out of the cold sky and pecked frantically at the grave earth until I killed him with a blow of my spade. Finally, I reached the rotting oblong box and removed the damp nitrous cover. This is the last rational act I ever performed. For crouched within that centuried coffin, embraced by a closed-packed nightmare retinue of huge, sinewy, sleeping bats, was the bony thing my friend and I had robbed. Not clean and placid as we had seen it then, but covered with caked blood and shreds of alien flesh and hair, and leering sentiently at me with phosphorescent sockets and sharp, ensanguined fangs, yawning twistedly in mockery of my inevitable doom. And when it gave from those grinning jaws a deep, sardonic bay as of some gigantic hound, and I saw that it held in its gory, filthy claw the lost and fateful amulet of green jade. I merely screamed and ran away idiotically, my screams soon dissolving into peals of hysterical laughter. Madness rides the star wind. Claws and teeth sharpened on centuries of corpses. Dripping death astride a bacchanal of bats from night-black ruins of buried temples of Belial. Now, as the baying of that dead, fleshless monstrosity grows louder and louder, and the stealthy whirring and flapping of those accused webbed wings circles closer and closer. I shall seek with my revolver the oblivion which is my only refuge from the unnamed and unnameable. The Survivor by H.P. Lovecraft and August Derleth. Certain houses, like certain persons, manage somehow to proclaim at once their character for evil. Perhaps it is the aroma of evil deeds committed under a particular roof long after the actual doers have passed away that makes the goose flesh come and the hair rise. Something of the original passion of the evildoer and of the horror felt by his victim enters the heart of the innocent watcher, and he becomes suddenly conscious of tingling nerves, creeping skin, and a chilling of the blood. Algernon Blackwood. I had never intended to speak or write again of the Charriere house once I had fled Providence on that shocking night of discovery. There are memories which every man would seek to suppress, to disbelieve, to wipe out of existence. But I am forced to set down now the narrative of my brief acquaintance with the house on Benefit Street, and my precipitate flight therefrom, lest some innocent person is subjected to indignity by the police in an effort to explain the horrible discovery the police have made at last. That same ghastly horror it was my lot to look upon before any other human eye, and what I saw was surely far more terrible than what remained to be seen after all these years, the house having reverted to the city as I had known it would. While it is true that an antiquarian might be expected to know considerably less about some ancient avenues of human research than about old houses, it is surely conceivable that one who is steeped in the processes of research among the habitations of the human race might occasionally encounter a more abstruse mystery than the date of an ell or the source of a gambrel roof, and find it possible to come to certain conclusions about it, no matter how incredible, how horrible, or frightening, or even, yes, damnable. In those quarters where antiquarians gather, the name of Elijah Atwood is not entirely unknown. Modesty forbids me to say more, but it is surely permissible to point out that anyone sufficiently interested to look up references will find more than a few paragraphs about me in those directories devoted to information for the antiquary. I came to Providence, Rhode Island in 1930, intending to make only a brief visit and then to go on to New Orleans. But I saw the Charriere House on Benefit Street and was drawn to it as only an antiquarian would be drawn to any unusual house isolated in a New England street of a period not its own, a house clearly of some age and with an indefinable aura that both attracted and repelled. What was said about the Charriere House, that it was haunted, was no more than what was said about many an old, abandoned dwelling in the old world as well as in the new. Of ghosts, I do not wish to write. Suffice it to say that there have been within the circle of my experience certain manifestations which have lent themselves to no scientific explanation, though I am rational enough to believe that there is such explanation to be found once man chances upon the proper interpretation through the correct scientific approach. In that sense, surely the Charriere House was not haunted. No specter passed among its rooms, rattling its chain. No voice moaned at midnight. No sepulchral figure appeared at the witching hour to warn of approaching doom. But that there was an aura about the house, one of evil, of terror, of hideous, eldritch things, none could deny. And had I been born a less insensitive clod, I have no doubt that the house would have driven me forth, raving, out of mind. Its aura was less tangible than others I have known, but it suggested that the house concealed unspeakable secrets, long hidden from human perception. Above all else, it conveyed an overpowering sense of age, of centuries not alone of its own being, but far, far in the past, when the world was young, which was curious indeed, for the house, however old, was less than 3 centuries of age. I saw it first as an antiquarian, delighted to discover set in a row of staid New England houses, a house which was manifestly of a 17th century Quebec style, and thus so different from its neighbors as to attract immediately the eye of any passerby. I had made many visits to Quebec, as well as to other old cities of the North American continent, but on this first visit to Providence, I had not come primarily in search of ancient dwellings, but to call upon a fellow antiquarian of note, and it was on my way to his home on Barn Street that I passed the Charriere House, observed that it was not tenanted, and resolved to lease it for my own. Even so, I might not have done so had it not been for the curious reluctance of my friend to speak of the house, and, indeed, his seeming unwillingness that I go near the place. Perhaps I do him an injustice in retrospect, for he, poor fellow, was even then on his deathbed, though neither of us knew it. So it was at his bedside I sat, and not in his study, and it was there that I asked about the house, describing it unmistakably, for, of course, I did not then know its name or anything about it. A man named Charrière had owned it, a French surgeon who had come down from Quebec, but who had built it, Gamwell did not know. It was Charrière he had known, a tall, rough-skinned man. I saw little of him, but no one saw more. He had retired from practice, said Gamwell. He had lived there, and presumably older members of his family, though Gamwell could not say as to this, for as long as Gamwell had known the house, Dr. Charrière had lived a reclusive life and had died, according to notice duly published in the Providence Journal in 1927, 3 years ago. Indeed, the date of Dr. Charrière's death was the only date that Gamwell could give me. All else was shrouded in vagueness. The house had not been rented more than once. There had been a brief occupation by a professional man and his family, but they had left it after a month, complaining of its dampness and the smells of the old place. Since then, it had stood empty, but it could not be torn down, for Dr. Charrière had left in his will a considerable sum of money to keep the property off the tax delinquent list for a long enough time, some said 20 years, to guarantee that the house would be standing there if and when heirs of the surgeon appeared to lay claim to it, the doctor having written vaguely of a nephew in French Indochina on military service. All attempts to find the nephew had proved futile, and now the house was being permitted to stand until the period specified in the will of Dr. Charrière had expired. I think of leasing it, I told Gamwell. Ill though he was, my fellow antiquarian raised himself up on one elbow in protest. A passing whim, Atwood. Let it pass. I have heard disquieting things of the house. What things? I asked him bluntly. But of these things he would not speak. He only shook his head feebly and closed his eyes. I hope to examine it tomorrow, I went on. It offers nothing you could not find in Quebec. Believe me, said Gamwell. But, as I have set forth, his curious opposition served only to augment my desire to examine the house at close range. I did not mean to spend a lifetime there, but only to lease it for a half year or so and make it a base of operations while I went about the countryside around the city, as well as the lanes and byways of Providence, in search of the antiquities of that region. Gamwell did surrender at last the name of the firm of lawyers in whose hands the Charrière will had been placed, and when I made application to them and overcame their own lack of enthusiasm, I became master of the old Charrière house for a period of not more than 6 months, and less, if I so chose. I took possession of the house at once, though I was somewhat nonplussed to discover that, while running water had been put in, electricity had not. I found among the furnishings of the house, these had been left in each room, exactly as at the death of Dr. Charrière, a half-dozen lamps of various shapes and ages, some of them apparently dating back a century or more, with which to light my way. I had expected to find the house cobwebbed and dusty, but I was surprised to learn that this was not the case, though I had not understood that the lawyers, the firm of Baker and Greenbaugh, had undertaken to care for the house during the half-century it was to stand, short of someone's appearing to lay claim to it as the sole survivor of Dr. Charrier and his line. The house was all I had hoped for. It was heavily timbered, and in some of the rooms paper had begun to peel from the plaster, while in others the plaster itself had never been covered and shone yellow with age on the wall. Its rooms were irregular, appearing to be either quite large or very small. It was of 2 stories, but the upper floor had not been much used. The lower or ground floor, however, abounded in evidence of its one-time occupant, the surgeon, for one room of it had manifestly served him as a laboratory of some kind, and an adjoining room as a study, for both had the look of having been but recently abandoned in the midst of some inquiry or research, quite as if the occupation of the house by its brief tenant, post-mortem Charrier, had not touched upon these rooms. And perhaps it had not, for the house was large enough to permit of habitation without disturbing them, both laboratory and study being at the back of the building, opening out upon a garden, now much overgrown with shrubs and trees, a garden of some size, since the house occupied a frontage of over 3 lots in width, and in depth reached to a high stone wall, which was but a lot removed from the street in its rear. Dr. Charrier had evidently been in the midst of some work when his hour had struck, and I confess its nature intrigued me at once, for it was plainly no ordinary one. The inquiry was not alone a study of man, for there were strange, almost Kabbalistic drawings, resembling physiological charts of various kinds of saurians, though the most prominent among them were of the order Loricata and the genre Crocodilus and Osteolaemus, though there were also recognizable drawings of Gavialis, Tomastoma, Gaiman, and Alligator, with a lesser number being speculative sketches of earlier members of this reptilian order reaching back to the Jurassic period. Yet even this fascinating glimpse of the surgeon's odd vein of inquiry would not have stimulated any really genuine delving into his affairs had it not been for the antiquarian mystery of the house. The Charrier house impressed me at once as having been the product of its age, save for the latter introduction of waterworks. I had all along assumed that Dr. Charrier himself had built it. Gamwell had nowhere in our somewhat elliptical conversation given me to understand otherwise, nor had he, for that matter, mentioned the surgeon's age at his death. Presuming it to be a well-rounded 80 years, then it was certainly not he who had built the house, for internal evidence spoke clearly of its origin in the vicinity of the year 1700, or over 2 centuries before Dr. Charrier's death. It seemed to me, therefore, that the house only bore the name of its most recent longtime tenant, and not that of its builder. It was the pursuit of this problem which brought me to several disturbing phenomena which bore no relationship, seemingly, to credible facts. For one thing, the year of Dr. Charrier's birth was nowhere in evidence. I sought out his grave. It was, strangely, on his own property. He had obtained permission to be buried in his garden, not far from a gracious old well which stood roofed over, with bucket and all still as it had stood, doubtless for almost as long as the house had been standing, with a view to examining his headstone for the date of his birth. To my disappointment and chagrin, his stone bore only his name, Jean-Francois Charrier, his calling, surgeon, his places of residence or professional occupation, Bayonne, Paris, Pondicherry, Quebec, Providence, and the year of his death, 1927. No more. This was enough only to further me on my quest, and forthwith I started to make inquiry by letter of acquaintances in various places where investigation might be made. Within a fortnight, the results of my inquiries were at hand, but far from being in any way satisfied, I was more perplexed than ever. I had made my first inquiry of a correspondent in Bayonne, presuming that, since this was first mentioned on the stone, Charrier might have been born in that vicinity. I had next inquired in Paris, then of a friend in London who might have access to information in British archives pertaining to India, and then in Quebec. What did I glean from all this correspondence but a riddling sequence of dates? A Jean-Francois Charrier had indeed been born in Bayonne, but in the year 1636. The name was not unknown in Paris either, for a 17-year-old lad of that name had studied under the royalist exile Richard Weissman in 1653, and for 3 years thereafter at Pondicherry, and later too on the Coromandel coast of India. One Dr. Jean-Francois Charrier, surgeon in the French army, had been on duty from 1674 onward, and in Quebec, the earliest record of Dr. Charrier was in 1691. He had practiced in that city for 6 years and had then left the city for an unknown destination. I was left, patently, with but one conclusion: that the said Dr. Jean-Francois Charrier, born in Bayonne, 1636, last known to have been in Quebec the very year of the erection of the Charrier House on Benefit Street, was a forebear of the same name as the late surgeon who had last occupied the house. But if so, there was an absolute lacuna between that time in 1697 and the lifetime of the last occupant of the house, for there was nowhere any account of the family of that earlier Jean-Francois Charrier. If there had been a Madame Charrier, if there had been children, as assuredly there must have been for the line to continue to the present century, there was no record of them. It was not impossible that the elderly gentleman who had come down from Quebec might have been of single status upon his arrival in Providence, and might have married thereafter. He would then have been 61 years of age. Yet a search of the appropriate registry failed to reveal any record of such a marriage, and I was left more bewildered than ever. Though, as an antiquarian, I was fully aware of the difficulties of discovering facts, and I was not at that time too discouraged to continue my inquiries. I took a new line and approached the firm of Baker and Greenball for information about the late Dr. Charriere. Here, an even more curious rebuff awaited me, for when I inquired about the appearance of the French surgeon, both the lawyers were forced to admit that they had never laid eyes on him. All their instructions had come by letter, together with checks of generous figures. They had acted for Dr. Charriere approximately 6 years before his death and thereafter. Before that time, they had not been retained by Dr. Charriere. I inquired then about his nephew, since the existence of a nephew implied at least that there had at one time been a sister to the late Dr. Charriere. But here too, I was rebuffed. Gamwell had misinformed me, for Charriere had not specifically identified him as a nephew, but only as the sole male survivor of my line. This survivor had only been presumed to have been a nephew, and all search for him had come to naught, though there was that in Dr. Charriere's will which implied that the said sole male survivor would not need to be sought, but would make application to the firm of Baker and Greenball, either in person or by letter, in such terms as to be unmistakable. Mystery there was, certainly. The lawyers did not deny it, but it was understood also that they had been well rewarded for their trust, too well to permit of any betrayal of it save in such casual terms as they had related to me. After all, as one of the lawyers sensibly pointed out, only 3 years had elapsed since the death of Dr. Charriere, and there was still ample time for the survivor to present himself. Failing in this line of inquiry, I again called on my old friend, Gamwell, who was still abed, and now noticeably weaker. His attending physician, whom I encountered on the way out, now for the first time intimated that old Gamwell might not rise again, and cautioned me not to excite him or to tire him with too many questions. Nevertheless, I was determined to ferret out what I could about Charriere, though I was not entirely prepared for the keen scrutiny to which I was subjected by Gamwell, quite as if he had expected that less than 3 weeks' residence in the Charriere house should have altered my very appearance. After the amenities had been exchanged, I turned to the subject about which I had come, explaining that I had found the house so interesting I desired to know more of its late tenant. Gamwell had mentioned seeing him. "But that was years ago," said Gamwell. "He's been dead 3 years. Let me see. 1907. I think." I was astounded. "But that was 20 years before he died," I protested. Nevertheless, Gamwell insisted that was the year. And how had he looked? I pressed the question upon him. Disappointingly, senility and illness had encroached upon the old man's once fine mind. Take a newt, row him a little, teach him to walk on his hind legs, and dress him in elegant clothes, Gamwell said. I give you Dr. Jean-Francois Charrière, except that his skin was rough, almost horny. A cold man, he lived in another world. How old was he? I asked. Then, 80? 80? He was contemplative. When first I saw him, I was but 20. Then, he looked no older. And 20 years ago, my good Atwood, he had not changed a jot. He seemed 80 the first time. Was it the perspective of my youth? Perhaps. He seemed 80 in 1907 and died 20 years later. 100 then? It might well have been. But Gamwell, too, was dissatisfying. Once again, there was nothing definite, nothing concrete, no single fact, only an impression, a memory of someone I felt Gamwell had disliked for no reason he could name. Perhaps some professional jealousy he did not care to name biased his judgment. I next sought the neighbors, but I found them, for the most part, younger people who had little memory of Dr. Charrière, except as someone whom they wished elsewhere, for he had an abominable traffic in lizards and the like, and none knew what diabolic experiments he performed in his laboratory. Only one among them was of advanced age. This was an old woman, a Mrs. Hepzibah Cobbett, who lived in a little two-story house directly behind the Charrière garden wall, and I found her much enfeebled, in a wheelchair, guarded over by her daughter, a hawk-nosed woman whose cold blue eyes looked at me askance from behind her pince-nez. Yet the old woman spoke, starting to life at mention of Dr. Charrière's name, realizing that I lived in the house.
You'll not live there long, mark my words. It's a devil's house,
she said with some spirit that degenerated rapidly into a senile cackling.
Many's the time I've laid eyes on him. A tall man, bent like a sickle, with a wee tuft of beard like a goat's whisker on his chin. And what was it that crawled about at his feet I could not see? A long, black thing, too big for a snake. Though 'twas snakes I thought of every time I set eyes on Dr. Charrière. And what was it screamed that night? And what barked at the well? A fox, indeed. I know a fox, and a dog, too, like the yelping of a seal. I've seen things, I tell ye, but nobody'll believe a poor old woman with one foot in her grave. And ye won't either, for none does.
What was I to make of this? Perhaps the daughter was right when she said, as she showed me out, you must overlook mother's ramblings. She has an arteriosclerotic condition, which occasionally makes her sound quite weak-minded. But I did not think old Mrs. Cobbett weak-minded, for her eyes snapped and sparkled when she talked, quite as if she were enjoying a secret joke of proportions so vast that its very outlines escaped her keeper, the grim daughter who hovered ever near. Disappointment seemed to await me at every turn. All avenues of information yielded little more together than any one had yielded. Newspaper files, library, records. All that was to be found was the date of the erection of the house, 1697, and the date of the death of Dr. Jean-Francois Charrière. If any other Charrière had died in the city's history, there was no mention of him. It was inconceivable that death had stricken all the other members of the Charrière family, predeceasing the late tenant of the house on Benefit Street, away from Providence, and yet it must have been so, for there was no other feasible explanation. Yet there was one additional fact, a likeness of Dr. Charrière, which I discovered in the house, though no name was appended to it, where it hung in a remote and almost inaccessible corner of an upstairs room. The initials J.F.C. identified it beyond reasonable doubt. It was the likeness of a thin-faced ascetic wearing a straggly goatee. His face was distinguished by high cheekbones, sunken cheeks, and dark, blazing eyes. His aspect was gaunt and sepulchral. Thus, in the absence of other avenues of information, I was driven once again to the papers and books left in Dr. Charrière's study and laboratory. Hitherto, I had been much away from the house in the pursuit of my inquiry into Dr. Charrière's background, but now I was as much confined to the house as I had previously been away from it. Perhaps it was because of this confinement that I began to grow more keenly aware of the aura of the house, both in a psychic and a physical sense. That unhappy professional man and his family who had remained here but a month and then left because of the smells abounding had perhaps conditioned me to smell the house. And now, for the first time, I did indeed become sharply cognizant of various aromas and musks, some of them typical of old houses, but others completely alien to me. The dominant one, however, was identifiable. It was a musk I had encountered several times before, in zoos, swamps, along stagnant pools, almost a miasma which suggested most strongly the presence of reptiles. It was not impossible that reptiles had found their way through the city to the haven of the garden behind the Charrière house, but it was incredible that they should have persisted in such numbers as to taint the very air of the place. Yet, seek as I might, I could find no source of this reptilian musk, inside or out, though I fancied once that it emanated from the well, which was doubtless a result of an illusory conviction. This musk persisted, and it was especially strong whenever rain fell, or a fog formed, or dew lay on the grass, as might have been expected, moisture heightening all odors. The house was moist too. Its short-lived tenantry had been explained in part by this. And in this, certainly, the renter had not been in error. I found it often unpleasant, but not disturbing. Not half so disturbing as other aspects of the house. Indeed, it was as if my invasion of the study and laboratory had stirred the old house to protest, for certain hallucinations began to occur with annoying regularity. There was, for one, the curious barking sound which seemed to emanate from the garden late at night, and for another, the illusion that an oddly bent reptilian figure haunted the darkness of the garden outside the study windows. These and other illusions persisted, and I, in turn, persisted in looking upon them as hallucinatory, until that fateful night when, after hearing a distinct sound as of someone bathing in the garden, I woke from my sleep, convinced that I was not alone in the house, and, putting on my dressing robe and slippers, I lit a lamp and hurried to the study. What I saw there must certainly have been inspired by the nature of my inquiry into the late Dr. Charrier's papers. That it was a figment of a nightmare, I could not doubt at the moment, though I caught but a faint glimpse of the invader, for there was an invader in the study, and he made off with certain papers belonging to the Charrier estate. But as I saw him in the brief glimpse I had of him in the wan yellow light of the lamp held overhead and partially blinding me, he seemed to glisten. He shone blackly, and he seemed to be wearing a skin-tight suit of some rough black material. I saw him for only an instant before he leapt through the open window into the darkness of the garden. I would have followed then, had it not been for the disquieting things I saw in the light of the lamp. Where the invader had stood, there were the irregular marks of feet, of wet feet, and more, of feet which were oddly broad, the toes of which were so long nailed as to leave the marks of those nails before each toe. And where he had bent above the papers, there was the same wetness, and over all there hung the powerful reptilian musk I had begun to accept as an integral part of the house, so powerful indeed that I almost reeled and fainted. But my interest in the disturbed papers transcended fear or curiosity. At that time, the only rational explanation which occurred to me was that one of the neighbors, who had some animus against the Charrier house and were constantly agitating to have it torn down, must have come from swimming to invade the study. Far-fetched? Yes, certainly. But could any other explanation readily account for what I saw? I am inclined to think not. As for the papers, certain of them were undeniably gone. Fortunately, these were the very ones I had finished with. I had put them into a neat pile, though many were not consecutive. I could not imagine why anyone would have wanted to take them unless someone other than myself were interested in Dr. Charrier, perhaps with a view to laying claim to the house and property. For these papers were painstaking notes about the longevity of crocodiles and alligators, as well as of related reptiles. It had already begun to be plainly evident to me that the late doctor had been studying reptilian longevity with almost obsessive devotion, and with a view clearly to learning how man might lengthen his own life. If the secrets of reptilian longevity had been revealed to Dr. Charrier, there was nothing in his papers thus far to show that it had, though I had come upon 2 or 3 disquieting suggestions of operations performed on whom was not set down with a view to increasing the lifespan of the subject. True, there was one variant vein of notes in what I assumed to be Dr. Charrier's handwriting, treated as a related subject, but to me, one at variance from the more or less scientific inquiry into the long life of reptiles. This was a sequence of cryptic references to certain mythological creatures, particularly one named Cthulhu and another named Dagon, who were evidently deities of the sea in some ancient mythology completely unknown to me, and suggestions of long-lived creatures or people who served these ancient gods, named the Deep Ones, evidently amphibious creatures living in the depths of the seas. Among these notes were photographs of a singularly hideous monolithic statue of a distinctly saurian cast of feature, labeled E. Coast Hivaoa is. Marquesas, object of worship, and of a totem pole of the Northwest Coast Indians of a disturbingly similar workmanship, also reptilian in aspect, this one being marked Quecutul Indian Totem, Quatsino Sound, Sim, T, erected by Tlingit INDS. These curious notes existed as if to show that Dr. Charrier was not averse to examining rites of ancient sorceries and primitive religious beliefs in an effort to bring about some earnestly desired goal. What that goal might be was soon evident enough. Dr. Charrier had not been interested in the study of longevity for its sake alone. No, he had also wished to prolong his own life, and there were certain upsetting hints in the writings he had left behind him to suggest that, in part, at least, he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. This was a disturbing discovery to make because it recalled again the curious history of that first Jean-Francois Charrier, also a surgeon, about whose later years and death there was fully as much mystery as there was about the birth and early years of the late Dr. Jean-Francois Charrier, who died in Providence in 1927. The events of that night, though not frightening me too badly, did result in my purchasing a powerful Luger pistol in a second-hand shop, as well as a new flashlight. The lamp had impeded me in the night, which a flashlight would not do in similar circumstances. If indeed I had a visitor from among the neighbors, I could be sure that the papers he had taken would no more than whet his appetite, and sooner or later he would return. Against that contingency, I meant to be fully prepared, and if again I caught a marauder in the study of the house, I would not hesitate to shoot if my demand to stop where he was were not heeded. I hoped, however, that I would not have occasion to use the weapon in such a manner. On the next night, I resumed my study of Dr. Charrier's books and papers. The books had surely at one time belonged to his forebears, for many of them dated back through the centuries. Among them was a book translated into the French from the English of R. Weissman, testifying to some connection between the Dr. Jean-Francois Charrière, who had studied in Paris under Weissman, and that other surgeon of similar name who had, until recently, lived in Providence, Rhode Island. They were, en masse, a singular hodgepodge of books. They seemed to be in every known language, from French to Arabic. Indeed, I could not hope to translate a majority of the titles, though I could read French and had some smattering of the other Romance languages. I had at that time no understanding of the meaning of such a title as Unausprechlichen Kulten by von Juntz, though I suspected that it was akin to the Count de Erlet's Cult des Ghouls, since it stood next to that book on the shelf. But then, books on zoological subjects stood beside weighty tomes about ancient cultures. They bore such titles as An Inquiry into the Relationship of the Peoples of Polynesia and the Indian Cultures of the South American Continent, with special reference to Peru. The Narcotic Manuscripts, the Furtivus Literarum Notus by Giambattista Porta, Thicknesses Cryptographic, the Demonolatria of Remigius, Banfort's The Saurian Age, a file of the Aylesbury, Massachusetts transcript, another of the Arkham, Massachusetts Gazette, and the like. Some of these books were certainly of immense value, for many of them dated as far back as from 1670 to 1820, and though all showed much wear from use, all were still in relatively good condition. These books, however, meant comparatively little to me. In retrospect, I am constrained to believe that, had I examined them more attentively, I might have learned even more than I did. But there is a saying that too much knowledge of matters men are better off without knowing is even more damning than too little. I soon gave over my examination of the books because I discovered, pressed in among them on the shelves, what seemed at first glance to be a diary or journal, but was, on closer examination, manifestly a notebook, for the entries dated too far back to have encompassed Dr. Charrière's span of years. All were written in a crabbed, tiny script, which was most certainly the late surgeon's, and despite the age of the first pages, all had been written by the same hand, suggesting that Dr. Charrière had set down these notes in a kind of rough chronology, very probably from some earlier draft. Nor were they jottings alone. Some were illustrated with crude drawings, which were nevertheless effective, as are, on many occasions, the primitive paintings of untutored artists. Thus, upon the very first page of the hand-bound manuscript, I came upon this entry: 1851, period. Arkham, period. Asaph Gold, comma, D, period. O, period. And with it, a drawing, presumably of the said Asaph Gold, emphasizing certain aspects of his features, which were Batracian in essence, for they were distinguished by an abnormally wide mouth with peculiar leathery lips, a very low brow, strangely webbed eyes, and a generally squat physiognomy, giving them a distinctly and unmistakably frog-like appearance. This drawing took up the majority of the page, and the jotting accompanying it I assumed to be a notation of an encounter, evidently in research, for it could hardly have been in the flesh, with a subhuman type. Could the D period, O period, have been a reference to the deep ones, mention of which I had previously encountered, which doubtless Dr. Charriere looked upon as a verification of the trend of his research, a trend to support a belief he probably held that some kinship with Batrachia, and hence very probably also Saurians, could be traced. To that end, too, there were other jottings. Most of them were so vague, perhaps purposely so, as to seem to me at that first examination of them virtually meaningless. What was I to make of a page like this, for instance? 1857, St. Augustine, Henry Bishop, skin very scaly, but not ichthyaic, said to be 107 years old. No deteriorative process. All senses still keen. Ancestry uncertain, but Polynesian trade in background. 1861, Charleston, Black's family, crusted hands, double jaw construction, entire family manifesting similar stigmata. Anton, 117 years old. Anna, 109. Unhappy, away from water. 1863. Innsmouth, Marsh, Waite, Elliot, Gilman families. Captain Obed Marsh, a trader in Polynesia, married to a Polynesian woman, all bearing facial characteristics similar to Asaph Goads. Much secretive living. Women seldom seen in streets, but at night. Much swimming. Entire families. All the rest of the town keeping to their houses. Swimming out to Devil Reef. Relationship to D period, O period, very marked. Considerable traffic between Innsmouth and Ponape. Some dark religious worship. 1871. Jed Price, carnival entertainer. Billed as Alligator Man. Appears in pool of alligators. Saurian look. Long lantern jaw. Said to have pointed teeth, but whether real or filed, unable to determine. This was the general tenor of the jottings in the book. Their range was continental. There were notes referring to Canada and Mexico, as well as the eastern seaboard of North America. From them, Dr. Jean-Francois Charriere began to emerge as a man obsessed with a strange compulsion to establish proof of the longevity of certain human beings seemingly bearing some kinship to Saurian or Batrachian ancestors. Admittedly, the weight of the evidence gathered, could one have accepted it all as fact, rather than as wishfully colored accounts of people with some marked physical defect, seemed to lend to Dr. Charriere and his belief a strange and provocative corroboration. Yet, the surgeon had not often gone beyond the realm of pure conjecture. What he sought seemed to be the connecting link among the various instances which had come to his notice. He had sought this link in 3 bodies of lore. The most familiar of these was the voodoo legendary of Negro culture. Next to it, in familiarity, stood the animal worship of ancient Egypt. Finally, and most important, according to the surgeon's notes, was a completely alien culture, which was as old as Earth, nay, older, involving ancient elder gods and their terrible, unceasing conflict with equally primeval old ones who bore such names as Cthulhu, Hastur, Yog Sothoth, Shub Niggurath, and Nyarlathotep, and who were served in turn by such curious beings as the Techo people, the Deep Ones, the Shantaks, the Abominable Snowmen, and others, some of whom appeared to have been a suborder of human being, but others of which were either definite mutations or not human at all. All this fruit of Dr. Charrier's research was fascinating, but in no case had he adduced a definite, provable link. There were certain Saurian references in the voodoo cult. There were similar connections to the religious culture of ancient Egypt, and there were many obscure and tantalizing suggestions connecting the Saurians to the Cthulhu myth pattern, ranging far deeper into the past than Crocodilus and Gavialis, embracing Tyrannosaurus and Brontosaurus, Megalosaurus, and other Mesozoic reptilia. In addition to these interesting notes, there were diagrams of what seemed to be very odd operations, the nature of which I did not fully comprehend at that time. These were apparently copied out of ancient texts, particularly one given frequently as source entitled Die Vermis Mysteries by Ludwig Pren, another of those obscure references completely foreign to me. The operations themselves suggested a raison d'etre too astounding to accept on face. One of them, for instance, was designed to stretching the skin, consisting of many incisions made to permit growth. Yet another was a simple cross incision made at the base of the spine for the purpose of extension of the tailbone. What these fantastic diagrams suggested was too horrible to contemplate, yet it was part and parcel, surely, of the strange research conducted for so many years by Dr. Charrier, whose seclusion was thus readily explicable, since his was a project which could only be conducted in secret, lest it bring down upon him the scorn and laughter of his fellow scientists. Among these papers, there were also certain references set down in such a manner that I could not doubt they were the experiences of the narrator. Yet, for all that these antedated 1850, in some cases by decades, they were unmistakably in Dr. Charrier's handwriting, so that, accepting always the possibility that he had transcribed the experiences of someone else, it was evident that he was more than an octogenarian at the time of his death. Indeed, far more, so much more, that the very anticipation of it made me uneasy and cast my thoughts back to that other Dr. Charriere who had gone before him. The sum total of Dr. Charriere's credo amounted to a strongly hypothetical conviction that a human being could, by means of certain operations, together with other unusual practices of a macabre nature, take upon himself something of the longevity that characterized the Saria. That as much as a century and a half, perhaps even 2 centuries, could be added to a man's lifespan, and beyond that, given a period of semi-conscious torpor in some moist place, which would amount to a kind of gestation, the individual could emerge again, somewhat altered in aspect, true, to begin another lengthy span of life, which would, by virtue of the physiological changes which had taken place in him, be of necessity somewhat altered from his previous mode of existence. To support this conviction, Dr. Charriere had amassed only a number of legendary tales, certain data of a kindred nature, and highly speculative accounts of curious human mutations known to have existed in the past 291 years, a figure which later assumed far more meaning when I realized that this was the exact span of time from the year of the birth of that earlier Dr. Charriere to the date of the later surgeon's death. Nowhere in all this material was there anything resembling a concrete line of scientific research with adducible proof, only hints, vague intimations, hideous suggestions, sufficient in truth to fill a casual reader with horrible doubts and terrible, half-formed convictions, but not nearly enough to warrant the sober interest of any genuine scholar. How much farther I would have gone into Dr. Charriere's research, I do not know, had it not been for the occurrence of that which sent me screaming in horror from that house on Benefit Street. It was possible that I would have gone much farther instead of leaving house and contents to be claimed by a survivor who, I know now, will never come, thus leaving the house to fall to its ultimate destruction by the city. It was while I was contemplating these findings of Dr. Charriere that I became aware of being under scrutiny, that manifestation people are fond of calling the sixth sense. Unwilling to turn, I did the next best thing. I opened my pocket watch, set it up before me, and used the inside of the highly polished case as a kind of mirror to reflect the windows behind me. And there I saw, dimly reflected, a horrible travesty of a human face, which so startled me that I turned to view for myself that which I had seen mirrored. But there was nothing at the pane, save the shadow of movement. I rose, put out the light, and hastened to the window. Did I then see a tall, curiously bent figure, crouched and shuffling in an awkward gait into the darkness of the garden? I believed that I did, but I was not given to folly enough to venture out in pursuit. Whoever it was would come again, even as he had come the previous night. Accordingly, I settled back to watch, a score of possible explanations crowding upon my mind. As the source of my nocturnal visitor, I confess, I put at the head of the list the neighbors who had long opposed the continued standing of the house of Dr. Charriere. It was possible that they meant to frighten me away, unaware of the shortness of my lease. It was also possible that there was something in the study they wanted, though this was far-fetched in view of the time they had had to search the house during its long period of unoccupancy. Certainly the truth of the matter never once occurred to me. I am not by nature any more skeptical than an antiquarian might be expected to be, but the true identity of my visitor did not, I confess, suggest itself to me, despite all the curious interlocking circumstances which might have conveyed a greater meaning to a lesser scientific mind than my own. As I sat there in the dark, I was more than ever impressed with the curious aura of the old house. The very darkness seemed alive, incredibly remote from the life of Providence, which swirled all around it. The interior darkness was filled instead with the psychic residue of years, the persistent smell of moisture, accompanied by that musk so commonly associated with reptilian quarters at the zoo, the smell of old wood, old limestone, of which the cellar walls were composed, the odor of decay, for the centuries had begun to deteriorate both wood and stone. And there was something more, the vaporous hint of an animal presence, which seemed indeed to grow stronger with every passing moment. I sat there well over an hour before I heard any untoward sound. Then it was indistinguishable. At first I thought it a bark, akin to that sound made by alligators. But then I thought it rather less a figment of my perfervid imagination than the actual sound of a door closing. Yet it was some time before another sound smote upon my ears, a rustling of papers. Astonishing as it was, an intruder had actually found his way into the study before my very eyes without being seen. I turned on the flashlight, which was directed at the desk. What I saw was incredible, horrible. It was not a man who stood there, but a travesty of a man. I know that for one cataclysmic moment, I thought consciousness would leave me, but a sense of urgency coupled with an awareness of acute danger swept over me, and without a moment's hesitation, I fired 4 times at such range that I knew each shot had found harbor in the body of the bestial thing that leaned over Dr. Charriere's desk in that darkened study. Of what followed, I have, mercifully, only the vaguest memory. A wild thrashing about, the escape of the invader, my own uncertain pursuit. I had struck him, certainly, for a trail of blood led from the study to the windows through which he had gone, tearing away glass and frame in one. Outside, the light of my flash gleamed on the drops of blood, so that I had no difficulty following them. Even without this to follow, the strong musk pervading the night air would have enabled me to trace whoever had gone ahead. I was led, not away from the house, but deeper into the garden, straight to the curb of the well behind the house, and over the curb into the well, where I saw for the first time, in the glow of the flashlight, the cunningly fashioned steps which led down into that dark maw. So great was the discharge of blood at the well curb that I was confident I had mortally wounded the intruder. It was that confidence which impelled me to follow, despite the manifest danger. Would that I had turned at the well curb and gone away from that accursed place. For I followed down the rungs of the ladder set into the well wall, not to the water below, as I had at first thought I might be led, but to an aperture opening into a tunnel in the well wall, leading even deeper into the garden. Compelled now by a burning desire to know the nature of my victim, I pushed into this tunnel, unmindful of the damp earth which stained my clothes, with my light thrust before me and my weapon in instant readiness. Up ahead, I could see a kind of hollowed-out cavern, not any larger than enough to permit a man to kneel upright, and in the center of my flashlight's glow stood a casket, at sight of which I hesitated momentarily, for I recognized the direction of the tunnel away from the well led toward the grave of Dr. Charriere, but I had come too far to retreat. The smell in this narrow opening was almost indescribable. Pervading every part of the tunnel was the nauseatingly strong musk of reptiles. Indeed, it lay so thickly in the air that I had to force myself to press on toward the casket. I came up to it and saw that it lay uncovered. The trail of blood led to the edge of the casket and into it. Impelled by burning curiosity and a half-formed fear of what I might find, I rose to my knees and forced the light tremblingly into the casket. It may well be charged that after so many years, my memory is no longer to be relied upon. But what I saw there was imprinted indelibly on my memory. For there, in the glow of my light, lay a newly dead being, the implications of whose existence overwhelmed me with horror. This was the thing I had killed, half man, half saurian. It was a ghastly travesty upon what had once been a human being. Its clothes were split and torn by the horrible mutations of the flesh, by the crusted skin which had burst its bonds. Its hands and unshod feet were flat, powerful in appearance, claw-like. I gazed in speechless terror at the shuddersome tail-like appendage which pushed bluntly out from the base of the spine, at the terrible, elongated, crocodilian jaw, to which still grew a tuft of hair like a goat's beard. All this I saw before a merciful unconsciousness overcame me, for I had seen enough to recognize what lay in that coffin. Him who had lain there in a cataleptic torpor since 1927, waiting his turn to come back in frightfully altered form to live again. Dr. Jean-Francois Charrière, surgeon, born in Bayonne in 1636, died in Providence in 1927, and I knew that the survivor of whom he had written in his will was none other than himself, born again, renewed by a hellish knowledge of long-forgotten eldritch rites, more ancient than mankind, as old as that early vernal earth on which great beasts fought and tore. Thank you for listening.
Have a great night.